Hey everyone, so I just wanted to give an update briefly on the work that I'm doing when it pertains to Judaism, infallibility, and especially my work on the papacy. So the first thing is that I've noticed that a lot of people have mentioned how, for instance, I emphasize that I try and use sources that are within living memory of the apostles, such as the earliest church fathers like St. Irenaeus, St. Clement, or, for instance, I at least say that if I'm going to use later sources, like, for instance, the Avraham Petra Midrash, written in the 13th century anonymously, that one of the things I look for is if that source can trace its origins or at least its material back to the first century or even earlier. And for instance, David Biven, in his article in the first century language environment of Judea, published by Brill Academic Publishers, Biven mentions the fact that the 13th century Midrash is commonly used by scholars in order to discern what was going on in Matthew 16:18, and moreover, he at least believes that the evidence can be traced back. And then, you have other sources such as Isaiah 51, 1 to 2, where it talks about how Abraham is the rock of Israel. And then even Biven in his paper, he talks about, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Thanksgiving hymn, talks about how God builds communities on rocks, right? So he combines all of that together to eventually come to the conclusion, although his paper was concerning what language Christ spoke when he made the Matthew 16:18 declaration. But still, like, he uses that to understand what's going on. So these sources that span out. And that's why, too, like, for instance, the Petret Moshe, which talks about, for instance, Moses handing over his mother to Joshua before he dies, or even the Cathedra of Moses, right? That is around 1,000 years after Christ, right? And the reason why I mention that, the Petret Moshe, one is that Roger David Oss uses it in his book on John 21:15 and 19. But moreover, Oss doesn't just cite the Petret Moshe to talk about Joshua receiving the throne of Moses. So he talks about sources around the time of Jesus as well. So whenever someone mentions that, I hope they also mention the rest of what Oss has done. So for instance, let me pull up my paper real quick that I had published in the Haythrop Journal to explain this point. So, and even Oss, his book is on Google Books, at least most of it. So if you want to read it online, then you can see it. So here's what he says. He says, quote, Moses is raising Joshua into the seat before him in the pre-70 CE Palestinian writing Testament of Moses with the noun cathedra for seat. And by the way, the testament or the Assumption of Moses is cited, or at least it's referenced in Jude 1:9, so this was around the first century, and his seating or causing Joshua to sit upon his chair/armchair in the Tanakh Midrash Sifra on Numbers 27:19, as well as his seating Joshua on a golden throne in the much later and more embellished Petret Moshe, all go back to the Haggadic interpretation of Numbers 27:19. So, Oss is clearly saying here that this is a consistent part of the Jewish interpretation of these particular passages, or at least when he's extracting the claims about the throne or the chair of Moses. This has been something that was there from the beginning and until the later sources. The other thing that you have to keep in mind, right, is that during the time of Jesus, especially with respect to the oral Torah, a lot of the rabbis would strictly say you can't write down what's in the oral Torah. Although that changes when eventually the Mishnah is compiled. Now, if you buy a copy of the Mishnah, usually in the back, in the index, it explains to you how the Mishnah includes citations from rabbis before the first century, during the first century, and then includes the Tanaz in the later centuries, okay? So for instance, if you're going to look at a source, a Jewish source, there's a difference between when the source was compiled and when the particular parts were written. So for instance, with the Mishnah has rabbis from before the first century, during the first century, and even afterwards, all being cited. So the point that I want to make here is that when we're talking about a source with respect to the Jewish literature, when someone says, oh yeah, it's way later, are they talking about when it was compiled or when the specific authors or rabbis they cite when they wrote, okay? So for instance, Rabbi Natan, so apparently like the Avodah Rabbi Natan was finally compiled in the 700s or the 900s, right? But then Rabbi Natan was alive in the 2nd century. So then clearly what happens is he begins writing and then other rabbis seem to write later on. And this is kind of like the case with the Psalms, for instance, right? So the Psalms, you have some of the poetry of King David, then later other people add on to the Psalms, right? And the same thing's going on there. So when people make these arguments as if they're like huzzah arguments or whatever, one is that my question is how familiar are they with the actual scholarship on the New Testament that uses Jewish sources? Because if they just say this like as a hit and run argument and they don't mention, for instance, that scholars commonly use the 13th century Avraham Petra Midrash, the Yalkut Shimoni, that's the other name that it goes by. If they don't mention the difference between when the source was compiled versus when it was written, if they don't mention all these other important distinctions, like for instance, neither I nor Roger David Oss only cite the Petrat Moshe to talk about the throne of Moses and Joshua receiving it, right? So I'm saying all of this in order to make sure that you're not like misled, okay? Because, for instance, when I cite Siftei Shakamin by Rabbi Shabbatai Bass, I think sometimes so I need to be clear, that was written in the 17th century. One of the reasons why I cited it was because it shows in the Jewish tradition pre-Vatican I that you had the rabbis already talking about, for instance, the infallibility of the High Court of Moses in Deuteronomy 17. Okay. The second thing is that I've recently been in contact with Craig S. Keener, and Craig S. Keener directed me to his book on the Gospel of Matthew, a socio-cultural rhetorical approach, or something like that. So it's kind of his sequel or revision of his earlier commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. And in that commentary, he cites the early rabbinic sources that talk about the infallibility of the high court, or that talk about how the heavenly Sanhedrin backs the rulings of the earthly Sanhedrin, hence why Jesus says that whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. The reason why Jesus invokes heaven is because during the time of Christ, or at least the earliest sources, they talk about how the earthly Sanhedrin will have the backing of the heavenly Sanhedrin. So the heavenly Sanhedrin will make a ruling, the earthly Sanhedrin will follow. And then, and even too, Herbert Basser, who's another scholar that I've cited, he's, I believe, both a rabbi and a New Testament scholar. He has a paper, and if you look on academia, it talks about how the New Testament is also used to date when Jewish sources were written. So, for instance, a Jewish source might appear to be later, but then if its contents are mentioned in the New Testament during the first century, then we know that the contents of that Jewish source, even if they were compiled later, were already in the first century. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So I'm not going to take in these kind of huzzah, arguments that just kind of quickly kind of say, oh, here it's 17th century, bam, it's just all dead and done. So the reason why I cited the Siftei Shakamin was because during the time of writing my paper, Roman and Catholic, in response to Jerry Walls, that was the only source that I was familiar with that talked about the infallibility of the High Court of Moses before Vatican I. And the thing is, I didn't want to be accused of citing a rabbinic source after Vatican I, so that someone could say, oh well, that's just because the rabbi is trying to claim is inspired by Vatican I, and he's just trying to say that about himself or about the Jewish court, right? I want to show that this idea of infallibility existed before Vatican I, okay, before a lot of the developments in Christianity, right? And then and that's what my entire research this summer is dedicated to. It's dedicated to the question of rabbinic infallibility during the time of Christ. So that's what my research is about. So I'm hoping that this video will provide an important clarification, and also that when people bring up, for instance, the Siftei Shakamin, I want them to understand the context of why I cited that source. And also, I don't think in my academic article published in Haythrop, I never said it was written in the first century. All I said was that Rabbi Shabbatai Bass attributes infallibility to it. Right, because in Deuteronomy 17, it says that even if the judge tells you to go right and you think you should go left, you have to listen to the judge, right? You have to obey him. And then I can go on and on about, for instance, Uriah Kaplan, in his handbook to Jewish thought, he talks about how the Sanhedrin reveals the divine will. Now, Uriah Kaplan is in the 20th century, but he's doing a summarization of Jewish thought throughout the centuries. So then, all these distinctions need to be made, all these clarifications need to be made. And I think that, if someone's going to say this, I hope that they are familiar with New Testament scholarship, and they're familiar with the difference between when a source was written versus when it was compiled, right? And which parts of the source are earlier and which parts are later, and that sort of thing as well. So, I'm just, I can just go on and on about, for instance, in Matthew 23, 2-3, Jesus says, you have to obey the scribes and Pharisees because they're seated on the seat of Moses, right? And then you learn in the Avot of Rabbi Natan that the rabbis believed that their succession to the seat of Moses came through Joshua. Okay, so then that starts making more sense of why Jesus is claiming that the rabbis are seated on the throne of Moses or the seat of Moses in the first century, right? So all of these things need to be taken into consideration, and I don't want, I want to be friendly in this debate, but I also would prefer if people didn't kind of use these huzzah one-liner or zingers or whatever as if they've like, gotcha, right? Like if you have a question, then I'm more than happy to provide the context and to provide, what's going on. But when it's in this context of like you're obviously just trying to like pull me down or like, like expose me or whatever, I don't appreciate it. So aside from that, then I'm hoping that the conversation on this issue will become more academic and more scholarly, because honestly, I've been seeing people make all sorts of claims that are outright contradicted or refuted by the scholarship. So people are saying Eliakim's not a prime minister, Eliakim's office was, or was purely priestly and not, or whatever, or even people's total lack of awareness on the Yalkut Shimoni and how that 13th century rabbinic midrash is used, according to Charles Talbert in his 2010 commentary on Matthew, to influence scholarship to then identify Peter as the rock in Matthew 16:18 because of its first century ties, or at least how it has roots that are older than just the 13th century, or even the context about how the rabbis had to be persuaded, right, to start writing down their older sources because traditionally they were passed on orally and then had to be written later. I hope the conversation on this issue gets better, and that's all I can say.